Okay. Everything is messed up today. The first thing that we will cover today is forms, and we will see why we need to control forms and how Angular provides me with a module that makes our life easy when we build forms. And the second section of the lecture is working with the router. Angular also provides you with a module that gives you routing functionality that you'd like to add to your application. So we'll discuss these two concepts in details in this lecture. Start with forms. Every single web application has a lot of forms, 100%, starting with the login and sign up forms, all the way until you need ways to get some data from the user. So you want to build forms to add new content, to edit content from the user. And with forms, we have a problem that if you build a form at the DOM, let's say you have a username and a password field, and you have a button to submit. If you build this form with an input, another input, and a button, okay, then this is DOM state. That's DOM state. So adding the form HTML markup is not enough. And we need to do really an extensive work in JavaScript to be able to control the state. What if the user value was invalid? Are we just going to rely on the browser limited validation rules to set how long is the username should be, or whether the username does exist or not, or whether the complexity of the password meets certain security rules in your application? Should the submit button be active all the time to submit an empty form, or we should disable the submit button and only activate the button if both input fields are valid and entered? So the validation rules and the logic and the complexity that comes with form elements need to be shifted to the application state. So the component that render these DOM elements is basically what is the application state. And if I don't hear objects that gives me in real time the status of every single element and the collective status of the entire form, I cannot really control what's happening at the DOM. Users may be entering stuff, messing around, and then submit something to the backend. That shouldn't be the case. So I really need here some objects to represent these form elements. Angular does have a reactive forms module that gives you full functionality on how you could control a form. So the way we build objects to represent these form elements is by creating instance of form group. An instance of form group should represent the form. And then an instance, so if I create a new instance of this object, I create an object that represents a form. And then within this guy, if I create an instance, so new form control, a form control instance usually represent a single input or select element. So I need to create two objects here nested within this form group. And these are supposed to represent these two input elements. Now I have in my application state objects that are ready to represent the DOM elements markup that we added into the template. Now the next step is to connect these parts, because what I need to do is not only one-way data binding. So if my application changed the state of the form control, I need the DOM element immediately to reflect that change. And if the user made any changes at the DOM, I need it to reflect back immediately to the form control objects. So what I need is two ways data binding between these two and this guy. Why two ways by data binding? Because I need to be aware of if any changes happen to the application state, I need to immediately reflect that at the DOM. And if the user made any changes to the DOM, I need to be aware of all of these changes in my application state. That's why we do need two ways data binding. And Angular also does provide me with directives that I can apply on the form and the control. And these directives basically job is to make this link. So the directive to be applied on the form element is called form group. And the directive that we can apply on every form control is called form control. We apply these directives on the HTML tags to link the application state with the DOM state in real time. On top of this, every single object of these objects provide me with two observables, two streams. One stream to represent all status changes, and another stream to represent the value changes. Plus, I get full control on the validation rules that we can apply to every single form control. So as you can see, just by creating few objects and applying these directives, I get full control now on the form. So that's basically what we're going to do when we work with forms in Angular. The first step is to add the forms control, reactive forms control module into your application. Create objects in your application state to represent the form controls that you have in your DOM and connect these parts using the directives. And now enjoy the power of validation, the power of status changes and value changes, and you get in real time a collective state and values to every single control and the collective status of the entire form. So that's what we're going to code today. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. So you just mentioned that it's a two-way chain. So uh, how the form group will, how the form group will change the data and the DOM will change. So I do not play on this bucket.
I didn't understand what you're saying. Can you rephrase?
Yeah, so on the picture, I saw you draw that the form group and we have a DOM. Yeah.
Yes.
So when the form group change, how the DOM change. So can you have to explain again?
Every single the form status is the collective status of all the elements. Okay, so every single time any element status changes or value changes, it's immediately reflected to the form object in your application state.
Yeah, how when we can on the form and it will be reflect on the pop-up, it will be send the event or how it will reflect.
Correct, correct. So what Angular does is to listen to all changes in the form controls and the form as a tag. You interact with it, you hover over it. It understands all this and reflect immediately these changes to the application state. I'm going to show you in the code how is that done. But the
Yeah.
idea here is I have an object that represents tag, and there is a live relationship, two ways the relationship between the two. Any changes you make to the object here, immediately you see it here. And every single time you make a change here, immediately reflected back to the application state. Plus, all the validation rules are applied in real time as well. So I'm going to show you that in the code. But
Okay. Yeah, super.
that's the idea of having two ways data binding. Any other questions? Good call. I need to code now. Go. All right. I do have a demo from yesterday. I should delete that. Mm, good. ng new demo. I'm still going to create an Angular application without routing because we didn't understand modules yet, something that we'll explain in details tomorrow. And until then, I'm still going to create my own router. But even after we understand how modules work, I still prefer to create my own router from scratch instead of relying on extra module for that. KCP demo code. So the first step to start using forms is to import the reactive forms module. Once you add this module into your application, now you are able to use all of these directives and services. So in your component, in order to build a form, you will need to create the form in the template first. So you say, I need a form, and within this form, I need an input to represent a username, or let's say email. Okay. And then you need another input for password, possibly. Let's set the tag to password here. And of course, you will need a button to submit this data. Okay. And I can set the type of this button to submit. So it's really going to submit the data. Now that I created my form in the template, it's time that I create the form in the application state. So I'm going to create a form instance, and this instance is going to be a form group instance. There is an easy way to create form group and form control instances using a service called form builder. So I'm going to use this form builder service. Now usually we say dot group, and that will create a new form group instance for me. So just calling dot group here will create a new form group instance. And that form should be bounded to the form tag. Let me call it my form to avoid any confusion. Now that I created this instance of form group, I need to bind it to the form at some point. Now within this form group, I need two form controls. And we can easily create that by having properties inside this object. So I can say I need a property called email. By default has no value. And I need a property called password that also has no value. Every single property in here represents a new form control. Instead of calling the instance manually, I use this service in order to create all of these instances in very friendly and easy way. Now next, I need to connect these parts. And to connect this part, if you remember, we used two directives, form control, name, and form group. So I'm gonna say here, form group. I'm gonna link this form to this variable. And I'm going to link form group to every instance of this. But there is an easier way to do that by using the directive called form control group, form group name. Sorry, not group name, form control. So I need to link this form control with this email. Instead of accessing this property from form and then email, an easier way is to use a directive called form control name, and I can immediately pass the property name that I choose inside the group. So I say the form control name is email, and form control name is going to be here passwords. And that's it. Now I have fully controlled form that I could set all my validation rules and control and in real time. So let's take an example of all of these magic that I'm talking about. Let me serve the application. All right, here's my form, a beautiful form. Okay, I have my email, my password, and submit. Let me show you the console here. Before I show you the console, I would like to show you an inspection to the DOM. As you can see, automatically Angular is adding some classes that to represent the status of every single control and the status of the form itself. So the form by default has been still untouched in a pristine state, and it's valid because I didn't add any validation rules yet. The first input element also is still untouched in pristine state and valid. So pristine will become dirty when I change the original value. If I did not change the original value, it's still pristine state. And untouched will become touched, regardless if I make any changes, only when you blur. So when I come here and then leave it. Now when I left it, the form become touched, the email become touched, but the password still untouched. And all of these values are pristine. So I didn't make any changes yet to the values. Once I add change to the value, you see can immediately, now the value class has changed to become dirty. Dirty only means that I made changes to the value. We can revert to the original pristine state if I created a button called reset. Reset button will revert the form to its original state. So it will become pristine again. Sometimes when you have a reset button, it's very dangerous because you lose some values. This is why it's a common practice that you say, I need to use the non-nullable form of this form builder. Or you could just immediately use another service called non-nullable form builder. Both of these ways are the same. It will guarantee that even if there is a reset button, the values of this email and password will remain string and will never become null. So this is something very common mistake that developers make to forget to handle the null state if they have a reset button. Now for me, I don't have a reset button, so I will not have this case. So if you use any CSS library that support all of these classes, automatically you'll see nice changes at the DOM to represent the form status. Now let's add some functionality to this form, some validation rules, some listening to events, etc. So what I would first do is to handle the submit. Okay? So to handle the submit, we listen to an event called ng-submit. And when that happens, you can do anything you want. So I'm going to say login or login. Let's create the login method. And let's basically console.log the form value. So the form value will be an object in this case that represents the email and the password. If you want to see that in action, here's the console. So if this is my email and the password, I enter the password, I hit submit. And as you can see, it's an object that has email and password properties. This object is ready to be sent to the backend server in a post request and to persist these or to check the password against the password in the database and validate the user. So that's how simple it is to work with the logic of the form. I keep closing this and I always need to console back. Okay, nice. The next thing I want to show you is how to add validation rules. To add validation rules, we replace this default value with an array. And this first element now in the array represents the default value. And the second element of the array will be the validation rules. So I want both of them to be required. Otherwise, I don't want this form to, I don't want to save anything. So there is an interface called validators that gives me a variety of validators that I can use, like email and max and in and required. For this specific field, I need to combine two validators. It is required and it is an email pattern. So I'm going to say validator.compose and pass here an array of validators dot required and validators dot email. The password I'm just going to keep it simple and required. Validators is required. Now still the submit button is active. Let's deactivate the submit button if the validation rules are not met. So what I can do here is I can set the disabled property of this submit button if the form is not valid. So if my form dot valid is not, if it's not valid, it will become true and I deactivate the button, disable it. Only when I enter a valid email and a password, now the submit button activates and I can submit the value of the form. If my email format is not valid, the submit button disabled again. So that's how easy it is to control the form and listen in real time about the status and validation of every control. If you want to set your own validators, that's also possible. So how about the password should not be 123456. If the password is 126, I'm going to reject that. So let's create our own validator. Validators.compose. And I'm going to pass required, of course, and I'm going to add my own validator. So this, not 126. I want to create this method that is going to check whether the value is 12346 or not. Okay, so this method will accept basically the form control itself. So control, form control. And now you need to return either null if it's valid or an object to represent that it is not valid. So I can simply just have an if statement. If control.value is 123456 as a string, of course, then it is invalid. So I'm gonna return an object invalid true. Otherwise, I'm going to return null. No or load matches this call. Argument of type. This is so hard to read here. Okay. Validator is a function that processes a form control or collection controls. Okay.
Professor,
Yes.
suppose I'm not the function not 126 it seem it require the return the true or false. It's not return the nonce or object.
So this is a function that's going to accept a form control element and
It's
either
accept the boolean.
return, yeah, it's either return an object with invalid boolean or null. But I am not sure why this is typed this way. But this is correct signature. Yeah, it's a correct signature. This compose is the one that's complaining. I think it's compose that's the one that's complaining. So I can pass this directive, this function and validators not required. That's also another way to compose two validations. Okay, like we solved it. So now if the password is 126, I'm going to return this object to indicate that it is not valid. So let me set a default
Professor,
value here.
can you press Alt Z on the screen so that word wrapping is on and we can see the whole code?
Alt C.
Yeah, Alt C. It like then you won't have to scroll horizontally.
So I don't have to. You want to reduce the size of the. What do you want to see?
Like right now you have to scroll horizontally in order
Yeah.
for us to, but if you press Alt Z, it will turn on the word wrapping and it will put the, like, if the
Oh,
line is bigger than the screen, then it will put the
okay.
code on next line.
So it is Option Z. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. I set the default value here, so I don't need to retype it again. Still, my form is invalid, and the reason is I don't have a password. By the way, I can show you in real time what's happening to the form. So what I could do is in the constructor here, I can say this dot my form dot status changes, and then I can subscribe to this status changes, and let's log what's happening. Okay, now the status 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of this valid 6. Now it's disabled and become invalid. Once I add different value, now it becomes valid again. So as you can see, I'm monitoring in real time the form status changes. I can do that for the form. I can do that for every control as well. And there is another observable that's also useful, which is value changes. And from the name, probably you guessed, every single time you change the value, you just, your function is going to be called console log, and you see the new value printed out. So here in this function, you could control validation rules, you can do different logic by listening in real time to the observable of the value changes, either on the form or on a single control. So I can say dot get password dot value changes. Now I'm listening only to the value of the password field. As I change it, it's just like I can control what the value is and send appropriate action. Any questions? So what we learned so far is we have a property, the first value of the property, usually the default value. What if I have the default value comes later? Let's say after you send the request to the database, so you could fill this form out. We also have in the API method that's called set value or patch value, and this API will change the value in the form. So let's say here in the constructor, I'm gonna mimic that delay. I'm gonna set timeout that after 5 seconds, I'm going to fill in the username or the email. So I'm gonna say after 5 seconds, hey, this.myform.getEmail dot patch value, and I can patch the value to a new value, which is the email. I can also set the password after a few minutes. And here I can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's valid. Password. What boolean? Not sure why. The password is absolutely not happy with the string. Of course, I cannot add a number if it's originally a string. Show me my form. Nullable. It is good that we always spend time to see what TypeScript is complaining about and fix those issues. So after 5 seconds, both were filled out, but still my component is complaining about argument of type string is not assignable to parameter of type string or I don't really have a clue how to fix that type error. I can look into this at some point in the break or during lunch break to see what how to fix this type issue. But you get the idea. To change form value later in the future, we could use patch value at any time to set a new value to the element. What other thing? Yeah. So the first parameter is the default value. The second parameter is a list of synchronous validators. Now the third value that this array can accept is asynchronous validators. And an asynchronous validator is basically a validator that doesn't give you a decision now. It's going to give you a decision later in the future. So let's create an asynchronous validator. So for example, the email will accept an asynchronous validator called not MIU. Let me create not MIU. And the signature of the function will accept the same form control, but the result here is an asynchronous result. So it's either an observable of objects or null, or a promise of object or null. Something that's really asynchronous, doesn't give you a result now. So let's immediately return something asynchronous here. So let's return a new promise, for example. And this promise is going to accept resolve. And inside the resolve, we can just decide the result that we want to send out. So we either resolve with an error or we resolve with a null. That's an example of asynchronous validator. Now this asynchronous validator is going to be immediately evaluated and resolved. So how about I delay this? Just to mimic that this is, for example, an HTTP call that's going to process this email before it decides whether it's valid or not. So what I'm going to do is to mimic that with the set time out. After 5 seconds, I'm going to check if the value is asaad.miu.edu, and if it's at asaad.miu, then I'm going to have it invalid, otherwise it's going to be valid. So for that reason, I'm going to disable this for now. And instead, I am going to subscribe to the status changes of the form. Okay, my form is invalid. Let me have this value. As you can see, the form status has been pending. After 5 seconds, it's going to become invalid. So basically, my asynchronous validator triggered and resolved with invalid state. Now, if my email is something else other than asaad.miu.edu, it's pending again. After 5 seconds, it will become, it's still invalid because I don't have a password. And now when I add something in the password, the form status become valid. So I just wanted to show you that while the asynchronous validator is being determined, the status of the form becomes pending until the asynchronous validator resolve with either null or an error. And now the status of the form will change from pending to valid or from pending to invalid based on the status of the other elements as well. So that's how you could create asynchronous validator to check something with the database and validate the form.
Professor,
Yes?
how come the form you entered is the MRI use, but in the validation you check is the MIU. How come it's become too valid? I see the different values in the line 36, and in
Yes.
the value in the form is different.
Yeah, when the value in the form different, now my form is valid. But when the value is the same, now pending, now the form will become invalid. So this value for me is invalid value.
Okay, I got it. Sorry. Thank you.
No problem. Yes. Any questions? You can easily display some error messages as well based on the status of an element. And in order to do that, it's common practice as well that you create some getters to these values. So for example, let's say if the email is not valid, I want to display span that says error in email. Whatever, you could decide. So here you add ngIf, and then you can say, hey, if my form dot get email dot not valid, so if it's not valid, then you want to display this error in email. And in this case, you see that error in email displayed, and once it becomes valid, now this is valid. Let's wait for it 5 seconds. Now the error message is gone. So basically, I'm displaying an error message based on an ngIf. Now, sometimes you don't want to write all of these getters. Instead, you want to create your own simple getter. And this is easily done from TypeScript. So I could create here a getter. So you say get, and then what the property that you want to create. Let's say I want to create a property called email. And now the email is going to return basically this dot my form dot get email. Let me just assure that the type is form control properly. Cast the type to form control. And now I can use this property as a shortcut for my form.getEmail. So here my condition in the template will become super easy, saying if the email is not valid, then display this error. And that's basically the same thing. Any questions? That will cover most of the form requirement that you're probably going to need in your applications. Let me review the slides and see if. So the first step is to import the active source module. The second step is to build the form object, which is a group that consists of multiple controls. Remember, every single element and every single form instance will give you value and validation, and you can change the value. We create the form elements in the DOM and connect them with form group and form control name. We listen to ng submit in order to listen to any submit event in the form and handle the submission. It's up to you to add any synchronous validators or asynchronous validator as the first and second elements into the array of the form control. To display error, we can simply create a getter just for easy access, and then I can have my ngIf condition. As you can see, this is very common that I listen if the form is invalid and it's dirty and touched. Why is that? Because probably you don't want to display error in email and I still didn't enter the email. So maybe we need to wait until I really change the email and probably hover out before I see the error. So this is the common practice to check after I leave the element, I change its value and it is invalid. Now I can display and check for errors and display what error I have. So you don't display the error right away. Remember, you have two observables to watch for any changes in the status and the value for the form as a collective state or for every single control of the form. Remember to unsubscribe when you finish or unmount the components. So in any case you have subscription, we remember to implement ng on destroy to unsubscribe from this. We don't cause memory leak in the application. So these are the main essential skills that we use to control forms. People from React, probably they know that there is a kind of similar technique, but they don't have this easy directives that they apply. So in React, you have to do the two ways data binding manually to call it controlled form. So you create the form in the template, and then you create a property in your state to represent the form element, and then you have to do two ways data binding manually. So you just do set a value from the state to the form, and then you listen to the form changes and set it back to the state. So you do that manually, and that's it. You don't get access to any validation rules or properties, or that's why like using a framework to give you all these tools to work with forms make it just more simpler and easier for you. After you create your first form, second form, third form just becomes habit for you, kind of a repeated actions of how you lay down the standard for your form appearance. Any questions?
Professor,
Mhm.
we have a two-way data binding between the form and the state.
Yes.
What's the first way and what's the second way?
So to prove, so you're wondering whether
I
it's
want
really two ways data binding?
I want to know the two-way bindings between the form and the DOM. So what's the first way and what's the second way?
There is no second way with forms. I mean, if you don't want to control the forms, it's up to you. But know that whatever you're making to the DOM, to the DOM, is not reflected in your application state. So you really want two ways data binding. There's no other way. The other way is not to have these elements controlled. So you remove this form control name. If I do that now, this email represents nothing. And whatever is happening in the email, I have no control over.
Or it's
I don't know if
affect
it's
to the
valid.
or when you change this, it affect to the application state and it's print out in the console as in previous.
Yes, I want whatever changes I make here, it reflects here. And every changes I make here, it's reflect back to this object here. That's why I make it two-way data binding by adding the form control name.
Okay.
At any time, I just say, for example, this form element dot, you can also trigger errors. You can set errors. If you set any error on an element, immediately an error will appear here, for example. So you see it as an error state. So whenever you make changes to the control, reflected to the DOM, and whenever you make a change to the DOM, immediately reflected back to the state. That's
okay.
how it works.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Let's take a break for 10 minutes. After the break, we can look at the router. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we were working with forms. And you remember I had an issue with typing to patch the value of the password for some reason. And it turned out that if you used a getter, there was no complaint about setting the value properly. So only when I just try to modify the value directly, now I get the error. Then I realized that if I removed my validator, the custom validator that I created, now I no longer have an issue. So my issue was the custom validator that I created. And when I checked again the documentation, it turned out that the parameter that we accept in the custom validator should be from abstract control type and not form control type. So if we change this to abstract control, now also my problem has been resolved. So I just needed to correctly type the parameter that these validators receive in order to fix any issues. I think it was saying to me that the error about this thing, but I didn't understand the error. So when I change it back to form control, see the error, it says that there's an abstract control and what it's receiving is form control, but I didn't analyze the error correctly. But now we know that we should basically have the parameter from type abstract control instead. And now the problem is solved. So that's a small type issue. The next part of this lecture is to implement routing. So what is routing? Our application is a single page application. So basically after we get the index HTML and the JavaScript files that's bundled with the index HTML, our application renders. Now our goal is to have this application not re-render, patch places in the DOM to reflect some URL changes. So if the URL is home, I need to render something. If the URL is about, then I need to unmount everything in this space and mount about component. If the URL changes to user/user ID, I need to unmount everything in this space and mount the user with the user ID details in this space. Now, note that all of these routes are client routes. These are by no means need to be defined at the backend server. The backend server has no idea what's changing here. The backend server is simply an API that we can contact with AJAX to persist data or retrieve data. But the backend routes have no idea about these client routes. These backend routes are just REST routes that control an entity with HTTP verbs to persist and retrieve data. The client routes, however, is to display screens, to display a form to add something, to display a form to update something, to display just a static thing, regardless if this form requires some data with the backend or not, now or later. So our goal is to create the structure. Luckily, in Angular, we do have a module that helps me build all of this functionality. It's called the router module. So the first step is to import the router module in our application and define our routes. So we're going to define routes array. You want to say that if the path was root, render the home component. If the route was about, then you want to render the about component. If the route was user and user ID, you want to render the user component. So the first step is to define all your URL to components route array. That's the first step. The second step is to build a template. So now your app component or the root component that you render, you bootstrap your application from, need to be converted to some sort of a template that have header, navigation, footer, and then you define an area you call outlet. This component called outlet is a component where all of these components will unmount and mount. The rest of the template will remain the same. So if you're going into the application and your route was about, the Angular router will go to the routes array and sees that inside this space, I need to clear it up and mount the about component. At any time the user changes the URL to something else, the router will clear the outlet out, go check the routes. Oh, now I need to render the user component, so it mounts the user component in the outlet space. So the question remains how. This is step number 2, to create the template with the outlet. Now, you're probably wondering, how do I navigate now between all of these routes without sending requests to the backend? We know that if I have an A, href, and I have go to about, if I click on this link, a get request to /about to the backend server is sent. That's absolutely I don't want to do. So instead, we are going to create our links in an Angular friendly way. So Angular can control all of these links. And we do that with a directive called router link. So we replace href with a router link. Directive. Now when I click on about, Angular router will stop the default behavior. See that I want to navigate to about, go check which component need to be mounted in the route. It will see the component, clear out the outlet, and mount the component in the outlet. That's pretty much it, how we add routing to our application. The first step is define your array of routes. Second step, create a template, and don't forget to add an outlet to it. Now, using small tricks like the router link, or there is another router service, will allow you to change imperatively the routing in the outlet based on the route that you define in the array. Let's implement all of these concepts in code so you understand where all these parts come from. The first step is import the router module. Here is my app module. I'm going to import the router module. Since this is my root module, the one that I bootstrap from, I'm going to call a method called for root. Tomorrow we will see how we use the other method in other featured module. And now we pass all the routes. So before I add any routes, let's create some components that match these routes. So ng generate component, I'm going to call the component home. Let's also create about. Let's also create users. And let's create one to display a single user as well. Sounds good. Now that I created all of these, let's add routing for them. So the first element is if the path was root, render the component home component. If the route was about, render about component. If the route was users, render users component. If the route was user slash user ID, for example, render a single user component. And it's always good to create a fallback in case the URL didn't match. So I'm just going to redirect here to home. Now, home basically route match all queries. So even if my query was /about, it will match the first one, and I will always render home. Unless you add match, can match, path match. Yes, path match full. So with path match full, guarantee that home component will only render if my path is /, which is the default one, because the / exists in every single route. I want to avoid this case and only render home when the path is completely empty. Now, this is the first step. Create the routes array. Let's convert app component to a template. So I'm going to say here header, my app. Let me create a footer, my app. Very creative. And let me add an outlet in between. So the outlet would be a component where all the other components will render within. Let me decorate the header and footer just to give them some sort of feeling of footer and header. I'm really bad in CSS. Used to be good, but I lost all my skills. So header probably is width 100%. And color is gray. Let's do the same for the footer. Yeah, I hope that will render nicely. Oh, we don't have comma here. This is not an object. I told you I lost all my CSS skills. You don't believe me. Okay, okay, it's background color. Just a small issue here. It's background color. All right, I think my website looks like a website a little bit. Does not, but that's okay. And I am good. I render the home component by default. Why? Because the URL is completely empty. So let's create some links that will move me between components. So inside the header, I'm going to create a nav. I'm using header and nav and footer because they are semantic here. So add the nav, I'm going to create, I don't know how nav works basically, nav HTML. Did you study this in WAP? Yeah, so we just add the links in the middle. Okay, sounds good. So inside the nav, we have the links to go to home. And about, and probably render the list of users, etc. Yeah, they look awful. Okay, that's better. Now let's add the what happens when we click on these links, and I'm going to do that not with the href property, I'm going to use the router link property. And the router link will accept an array of all the route pieces. And for home, I'm going to go to absolute root. For about, I'm going to go to about. And for users, I'm going to go to users. Now, somebody might wonder, can I just do this router link and then I pass /users? Yes, you can. That will do the same thing. But we do this syntax. Why? Because I create a platform independent route construction. So I don't depend that what I'm constructing here is something that starts with a slash, or just like when we used path in the backend, path.join, to construct a path that's platform independent. We do the same here at the front end. So whatever platform you're using when you're browsing this application, it will be constructed correctly. Now let's test about worked, users, worked. All of my components are rendering nicely. The URL is changing, as you can see on top, and the outlet is cleared and mounted. And if I wanna look at the network tab, and now I change, the view is changing, all is changing. There is no request made to any server. So basically all of this is JavaScript work to clear out the outlet and mount the components within. It's a single page app. We don't re-render or make any fetch requests unless the component itself making any fetch requests. So far that's good. Let's render. Let's learn how we can navigate imperatively between components. So what I can do inside about is to create a button that says go to home. How can I imperatively, when I click the button, I trigger going to home? I need a service called the router service. So private router as an instance of the router service. Now I can implement my go home methods. And I say this.router.navigate. And now I can navigate imperatively to anywhere I want in my application. In this case, I'm gonna redirect or navigate to root. So whenever I am in app and I click the button go home, I switch back to the home component. That's how easy it is to trigger navigation imperatively. we use the router service. Now let's learn how we can pass parameters or query parameters to a component and then read them and do some action. First, I need some sort of a way to display a list of users, and I want some way to display a single user. So just to make things like a little bit more real, I'm going to create a service that gives me these users. That's how we learned. Okay, so here ng generate service. I'm gonna call it data service. Okay, let's go to this service. And here you're supposed to inject HTTP client and do a proper request. For now, I'm gonna mimic that. So I'm gonna say get users. It's a method that's supposed to return an observable. So return an observable of. Let me create here some data basically. ID1, username, that full name. We're gonna keep it simple, easy, zero, Mike. Okay, let's add Mada. Okay, so here I'm gonna return data as an observable. Let's import off. Off basically it's a method that converts whatever you pass to an observable. Let me get user by ID, and I'm gonna receive the ID as a number here. And basically I need to get the user from here and then send it in an observable. So const user equal data dot find every user, find the user where the user dot ID equals the ID that I receive. They call it ID, yes. Okay, let me call it user ID just for better understanding of the code. And once I get the user, let's return an observable of this user. So that's a service that's kind of mimicking sending an observable of array of users and sending a single user by ID. Let me use this service now in my users components to fetch a list of users. And then when I click on the user, I want to display a single user in its own component. Let's do that. Users. I need my service instance. So I say user service. I'm not planning to use the service in the template, so I'm going to define it as a private member equal inject the user, the data service. I don't know why I call it user service. Doesn't matter, but naming is nice to be done properly. Now I can choose to read the data in the constructor or ng on init. Same. I'm going to use it in the constructor. So I'm going to say this data service dot get all users. Now I can choose to display the users with async type here or by subscribing in the class. And I think I'm gonna subscribe in the template. So let's display users. Users basically is an array of object that has ID as a number and full name as a string. And I'm going to instantiate this with an empty array. So since I'm planning to assign an observable to users, so I'm going to convert it to an observable. The $sign here is just a naming convention. You don't have to add it. It's just like a way to tell anybody reading your code that this is an observable. So I'm going to convert that to an observable of array of these types, and I don't want to instantiate anything now. And I'm going to import the necessary imports. Now I can assign this.users to get users. And get users in its own turn is going to return an array of objects. See, get users is going to return an array of object that has ID and full name. So that's perfect. Now let's display the list of users in the template. So I'm going to display each one in a paragraph. So I can say ng4 equal. And then I can say let user of users. Now I can subscribe. And I can display basically here the user dot full name as a variable. And I see all the names were listed nicely. Now, wouldn't it be nice to display some feedback about what's happening in the template as the data arrives? For example, what if my observable has some sort of a delay of 5 seconds? Because I have very delayed network. Delay should be imported from the operators, not from RxJS. So I just added some delay to the pipe before we get the users. And now, as you can see, my application was empty until I get the data. So it's kind of like weird. So for that reason, what we could do is we can have a div that has an ngIf. Once I get some data, I display the data. Else, I want to display some sort of a loader. So probably that's a good feedback. So we can create some loader ng template. I can call it loading, and that will display loading as a paragraph. This way, I can say load. I can see loading, and then when the data arrives, I see the data. But now I created. Where's the data? Oh, here's the data. It was. Now what I created is a problem that I created 2 subscriptions. And 2 subscriptions using the async is going to cause 2 requests to the backend server. So in this case, I can replace this by subscribing once, and then I say as users, so I save the results in users, and now instead of having another subscription, I immediately use the data from the previous subscription to display the users list. Now let's test loading 5 seconds. Now I see the data arrived after 5 seconds with a single subscription. So make sure if you need some ngIf and before you display the data is to save the subscription results and then use it later instead of making 2 subscriptions, because that will cause 2 requests going to the backend server to fetch the same exact thing. Now that I created all my data, I think I need something else. Okay, so we need hobby here. Okay, guys, so we display some details. So yeah, I play the violin, okay? And Theo, he likes to walk. And Mike, he plays the clarinet. And my sister plays the piano. Okay, now I have some mismatch, I guess, with the data types here. Okay, so that's okay because this is a partial. Now I need to click on the name and forward a request to user /ID and then fetch all the data details. Let's do that. We have time? Oh, you have a lot of time. Good. So let's do that. The first step is convert this to an A that display the full name and has a router link that goes to /users and then basically is the user.id. Now, if I check this one, I think we should reduce the time. Let's make it 500 milliseconds. Yeah. So now user /1, 2, 3, 4, that's perfect. When I go to the link, now I see that the URL does have the ID on top. My first task is to read the ID. My second task is to fetch the user details by ID. Let's do that. Here's the user components. Our first task is to fetch the ID. To fetch the ID or to fetch a query param, we need a service called activated route. So let's import this service. Private, I don't intend to use it in the template. Activated route equal inject activated route. Now in the constructor or ng-init, ng-init, I can say console. I can say this dot activated route dot. Now I see that they have something called param map, and I see something called query param map. Query param map will give you all the query parameters, and param map will give you an observable with all the params that you pass. So I'm going to use param map. Subscribe. Let's see what we get from this guy. And that's nice. I get an array basically that has params, and I see that user ID with the value 1 is already set within this guy. That's cool. So here I get all the params. And we could display the ID. Let me here create user equal an object that has ID 0, full name is empty, and hobby is empty. Let's display these details. Okay, I have no data so far. And now later I can say this dot user dot ID equal params dot get the user ID. And I know that I am reading. Of course, the user ID that we read here is string, and what I'm assigning here is a number. So maybe we should cast that to number. Conversion string to number is not possible. Okay, let's convert it to string first and then make it a number. That's also not possible. Thank you. All right, I did read the ID properly. Users, Theo, 2, good. So we're making progress. We managed to read the params from the activated route param map. Now, if I know that after I read the param will never change, I can read it in a different way. I can read it from the snapshot. So from the snapshot of the activated route, I can access the param map, and then I can get the user ID. That's also another technique. I can say this.user.id equal number of this. Of course, I needed to cast some types here just because I set this as number. However, from MongoDB, we receive it as string, so you don't need to do this casting. So now I got the same results. I'm reading this from the snapshot instead of subscribing to the param map observable. Now my step is to fetch the data. To fetch the data, I need my data service. So this .data service .get user by ID, and let's pass the user ID, and we subscribe. And after we subscribe, we get basically the user details. Again, you would like to subscribe here, you would like to subscribe here, all possible. I'm gonna subscribe here and say this.user, sorry. So I'm gonna get the user, and then say this.user equal user. Now type again is a problem because user is from type ID full name hobby. Sounds good. What about this one? Type number string string or undefined is not assigned to type number string string. So there is a possibility that this one sent me an undefined. And probably if I type the user properly, I could cast the user and get rid of the undefined. So let's create here an interface for the user. Export interface iUser, which is going to be ID number, full name string, and hobby string. Okay, now let's cast as iUser. Now everybody's happy, and yes, I managed to display all the details. You Asaad, Aiden. Sounds good. So that's how we read parameters from either the snapshot or from the activated route param map. If you need to read query params, you use query param map, and you do the same technique. There is also a snapshot for them. Or you subscribe to all observables if you have a case where the URL would change and you are still in the same components. So I guess this is good so far. What if I need here a button to go back? Let's add a button. Back. In order to go back, what do I need to do? Anybody? We need the router service. And now I can say this .router, .navigate, import router properly, .navigate, and I can go back to root, then the list of users. Now, after I display the name, I click back to display the list of users. Sounds good. Let's handle the case where we need to delete one of these users, and probably that's something you faced yesterday. I can say delete user by ID. So to delete a user by ID, basically all I need to do is, maybe I filter this data here. So I can say this. Maybe I say users equal users dot filter data dot filters, and then you get the user and you keep the user that does not match the user ID. And we also need to return an observable basically, but this time we're going to return access true from the database. And my list should be updated. So we update the database and then we return this mimicking request. Now, what do I do if I want to delete each one of these users? I'm going to go to my list. And next to each A, I'm going to create a button that's going to delete. So when I click on the button, I'm going to trigger delete user by ID, and I pass the ID. Let's define this method. I'm going to receive user ID as a number, and I'm going to send a request to the database. So I need my service. This .data service delete user by ID. I'm going to pass the ID, and I can subscribe. Now I'm going to receive a response, and I know that the response will tell me if I successfully deleted the user or not. Now, if I did remove the user, so many people, they triggered get users again. And you don't need that because I already have the users list, and all I need to do is to update it. But now I see that I don't have the users in my class. I have the users as an observable that I subscribe to in here. So this technique quite complicated. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to maintain a list of users here just for the purpose of updating the state. And I'm not going to subscribe in the template. I'm going to subscribe here. When I get the users, I'm going to take this .users equal users. This way, I can say if users, loop over them, otherwise display loading. So I just changed the subscription from the template into the class. This way I have access to this user's data. This way I don't need to trigger another fetch request. All I need to do is say this.users equal this.users.filter, and I'm gonna keep the user that doesn't match the user ID that I'm trying to delete. This way I filter the front end. So if I remove Theo, Mike, Ada, they just gone. Why? Because I'm updating the state to a state that doesn't include these users. That's the technique that we use. Any questions? Let me refresh to bring back all the users. Good. All right. The last thing that we will talk about is how do I protect? How do I protect front end routes from being accessed based on a condition? If the user didn't log in, why should I let them see the user details? Maybe they could browse the users, but I don't want to let them see the full details until they log in. How can I do something like this? And in Angular, we have something called guards. And a guard is basically a function or a class that will trigger to check if the user should go to this route or should not go to the route. And I can easily implement something like that. I can go to the data service. I can create here a method called isLoggedIn. And let's say this one will return. So inside the data service, I have property called logged in. And by default, it is false. The user didn't log in. So I'm going to return this.login. And I want to create a button that will allow me to log in as well. Should we build it as interactive way? If you want to build it as interactive way, then I need to change that from false to become behavior subject. That's going to return a Boolean. And by default, it is false. I'm going to allow access to this behavior subject for now. And whenever I'm going to return, I'm going to return the current value of the behavior subject. Now I could implement some logic to log in and log out and change this value reactively. Let's do that. In app component in the template, I'm going to add a button that's called login and another button to log out. Let's implement the click method. And let's see what we do with this. Login and log out. Of course, in order to change the state, I need a state service. So private data service, I guess I put it there. Service inject the data service. Now I can control the state. I can say this dot data service dot logged in dot next. When I log in, I'm going to push true. When I log out, I'm going to push false. In order to interact with this, I need to subscribe to the login. So let's do that in the constructor. State equal. I don't know what the state is. It's just a Boolean. In the constructor, I'm going to subscribe to logged in. And in here, I can say, hey, get the state and set this dot state equal to state. This way, I can conditionally display login and logout. So I can say if I don't have state. And the other one, if I do have state. So currently I have login. So since I am logged out, I need to protect this. If I click on it, I don't want to display the details. So how can I do that now that I implemented all of this? I can go to the route definition here. And for the last route, I can add a condition called can activate. And here I can pass multiple functions that to trigger to check certain logic. If I return true, the route will go through. If I return false, the route will not go. So here I can activate, I create a function and I say, hey, inject my data service. Return data service dot logged in. Well, I created a property called is logged in basically. That returns a Boolean. So basically here I'm returning a Boolean, either true or false, based if I logged in or did not log in. That's how you protect a route. You just add can activate and the condition. Now, if I click on Asaad, as you can see, I'm not able to go to any of these. But after I log in, now the button becomes log out. I try to go to Asaad. Perfect. Now I'm able to browse to the users. The moment you log out, you're unable to go to the users again. So basically, I created some sort of a defense to protect certain routes from being accessed unless a certain condition is met. In my case, it's just a flag in the user service. In your case, would be probably a token that you save somewhere. So you guarantee that the user has logged in. Any questions?
Professor,
Yes.
can you log out and click on delete button? Yes,
I am
and
logged
now,
out.
yeah. Now click on the delete button.
Mhm.
So the
I allowed.
delete.
Yeah, I allowed. I didn't protect this delete. I didn't do anything about it. If you want to protect also delete to only appear if you have a state, then you have to go back to the list. Where is the list? Here it is. Do I have a state here? Nope. Let's add the state. This dot data service dot logged in dot subscribe. And now here you subscribe to state. And you set some state in your component. So you have here state that doesn't have a value by default, supposed to be Boolean. Okay, you subscribe to it, and now you conditionally render the delete button. You can say ng if I have a state. Now, if you're not logged in, there is no delete button. Once I log in, the delete button appears. So basically, you prevent the deletion if the user is not logged in.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, Professor. Yesterday, for yesterday's assignment, where we had to get a list of meals and then we were required to delete a meal by ID. Um, I was wondering, is the behavior subject the only way to maintain a state, like on like in this component, you're keeping users in an observable Does that not mean that users is the state of this component? And what I wanted to achieve was that when I delete a meal, the list of the meals on the screen, like it should get updated automatically. So that's why I wanted to keep the list of users in a state. And I didn't want to make another call to the backend to get the meals again. So for in order to achieve that, like I wanted to delete the meal in the state. So my question is that in order to
I
like
like that idea. Yes, you can do that. You can persist the list of users here as a behavior subject, and you could change it. You can keep it here. You can elevate this to the service. All of these are valid patterns. So there's no one way. The way that you're talking about is nice. I like it. And you could certainly proceed with that.
yeah, so the state whenever we want to keep a state of something, we make a behavior subject, right?
It's one way. It's one way. Or let's say it's a current way of having an reactive state that could hold a value. So behavior subject is nice because it's reactive, you can subscribe to, and it keeps the recent value. So you can update it later.
Okay.
This is why it's nice. Now, why I'm saying it's one of the current ways, because in first week of May, which is 2 weeks from now, Angular 16 will be released, and they have something called signals. And signals is basically something to replace behavior subject, which has like a concept that, hey, I'm gonna create a native variable that is a stream using the signal constructor, and that would basically be the new way of maintaining Angular state. But for now, behavior subject is nice. Any other way that you're probably going to save the state and react to the state would be also acceptable.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? You want to practice today forms, and you also want to practice creating routes. Is it 12:07? Yeah, don't have time. Yes, we GitHub. So the same project from yesterday. After you completed that, then we will complement the application with 2 public routes for sign in and sign up. These 2 public routes should basically receive username and password. If it's a sign in, you have to encrypt the password and save it. You can use bcrypt. We did that before. And when you log in, you compare the passwords and you basically send a JSON Web Token back. And you can use this package to generate JSON Web Token, which is an signed object, send it back to the client. Now you need to create a middleware to protect all the other routes if only the request has a token, because the state will be saved at the client. The server doesn't have a state. And you need to create anybody who's going to list the meals or ingredients or whatever, they need to have a valid token. So the first step, they need to log in, sign up and log in before they can inquire any data from the rest of the API. Now, once this step is done, you could proceed by creating 2 forms in Angular, one for sign up, one for sign in. Both will send the data as a form. to the back end. And once you receive back a token, you need to persist this token somewhere. And what best way to save the token other than behavior subject in some sort of root service? So do that. And protect all the meals routes and other routes with the guard. So only if you logged in and you have state of logged in, then you can access those routes. Now, probably you want to use something that we did yesterday as a technique, is to persist this JSON Web Token in the local storage and retrieve it when the application initialize. Why you want to do that? Because every single time you're doing development, you make a change, you restart, refresh, you lose your state. Every single time you refresh, because of changes, you lose the state. So probably you want to do a technique we did yesterday is to persist the state in the local storage or session storage, and then retrieve it when the application initializes. This way you could build up easily and finish up the requirements. Any questions about the homework? I hope the majority of you will be able to complete this. If you need help, I'm ready to assist you. And tomorrow, remember, hopefully you get yourself familiarized with all of these concepts. We will build a full application that cover up the full stack, backend, front end stuff. Hopefully we'll finish that all tomorrow. All right, let's meditate and go to lunch.